Hi, I'm Joey D'Antoni. I'm Principal Consultant at Denny Cherry & Associates Consulting and a Microsoft Data Platform MVP. Welcome to Virtual SQL Bits 2020. This session is called Understanding Azure Active Directory for Data Professionals. In this session, you're going to learn about Azure Active Directory, how it's different from on-prem Windows Server Active Directory, how Azure Active Directory works with Azure SQL Database and Azure SQL Database Managed Instance, how you can use it in applications and manage identities across organizations in a manner that we couldn't do before as easily with Active Directory and Windows Server. So this session should be kind of comprehensive and give you a good understanding of what's available to you in Active Directory, Azure Active Directory, excuse me. Hello and welcome to Understanding Azure Active Directory for Data Professionals. This is part of SQL Bits, and as I mentioned, I'm Joey D'Antoni. I'm Principal Consultant at Denny Cherry & Associates Consulting. I'm a Microsoft Data Platform MVP, and I've been working with SQL Server and Microsoft Azure for 10 years, SQL Server for 20. You can find me at Twitter at jdanton. I blog at Joey D'Antoni, and I'm on Facebook and LinkedIn, but the best place to reach out to me is on Twitter. So modern IT infrastructure is very challenging. An organization's data can be spread across multiple applications, on-premises and the cloud, accessed by multiple users and devices, both internal and external. Identity can be the central point that connects it all. You want to have a single identity and access management solution to protect both your internal and external users and also help your business to grow and thrive by improving the user experience and productivity. You want to be able to, when you release a user or stop a user, you want to be able to suspend that user in one place. And you don't want to have ID sprawl, which is where you have 12 different identity providers within your organization. Azure Active Directory can help bring that together by being a central identity plane that can allow you to have single sign-on across lots of applications. So what we're going to cover in today's session is what is Azure Active Directory. We'll talk about the architecture of Azure Active Directory, how it's different but similar to on-prem Active Directory, and also how it integrates, because these two solutions do work together. We'll talk about how you make this work in the real world, and we'll do some demos with SQL as well as Azure Active Directory Connect. We'll also include a little bit of a talk about graphs. Azure Active Directory is all done through Graph API. So if you're familiar with graph technology, like that's in SQL Server, starting with SQL Server 2017, these are all graph queries that take place in order to authenticate and govern access. So Azure Active Directory is Microsoft's cloud-based identity and access management service, and it helps your employees and customers sign in and access resources in several areas. External resources like Office 365, the Azure portal, and lots of other software as a service applications that support using Azure Active Directory as an identity management tool. You're probably using this if you work at a large org, or if you work somewhere where you've used Office 365, you inherently kind of have an account. You can also use this for Windows 10 desktops. You can use internal resources like apps on your corporate network and cloud apps. There are a few differences between Azure Active Directory and regular Active Directory. Active Directory uses Kerberos for authentication, whereas Azure Active Directory uses SAML tokens, which are kind of a more modern web-based authentication method. There's a lot of certificates, and as opposed to tickets, which Kerberos uses. So you might wonder why we're talking about this at a database conference or SQL Bits. The main reason why I like to bring it up with DBAs is it's something that's kind of important for Azure SQL Database and Azure SQL Managed Instance. So as these platform as a service offerings become more integrated into our experience as DBAs, we see that we have to have understanding of them. There's a pretty basic configuration. If you have an Azure SQL database in a subscription, you can start adding Azure Active Directory users to it. However, it's a little bit more complicated than that in how we actually manage it. For example, you can't create, unlike in SQL Server, you can't create an Azure Active Directory user in an Azure SQL database as a SQL login. This is a bit of a pain point. because in things like automation, where you're running PowerShell commandlets, it's much easier to do a SQL login than an AAD login. I'll add a resource at the end for Rob Sewell's blog that highlights how to do this. And having some understanding about service principles and things like that can allow you to be able to do those sorts of things. So one thing I always like to share this slide on my cloud solutions is even though we have shared solutions and shared responsibility everywhere, even for platform as a service and software as a service, you're still managing a couple of things. Even though you're not managing servers or BIOSes or firmware or even worried about patching. In just about every case, even with software as a service solutions like Office 365, the customer is responsible for identity and security management. So in all places, you're kind of responsible for who has access and who can log in. The cloud vendor is not going to do that because they're not managing your people. So just note, no matter what you're running, whether it be a VM, whether it be a server on-prem, whether it be a SQL database, or whether it be O365 or Salesforce, you're responsible for user management. So who are the main users of Azure Active Directory? IT admins. So first of all, even if you're not really using Azure Active Directory on-prem, it's the only security mechanism for Azure resources. So who actually has access to those Azure resources is determined by Azure Active Directory. So inherently, if you're using Azure, you're using Active Directory because you have to limit who has access to your resources. You don't want to give subscription owner to everyone in your subscription. Obviously, that would be not good security practice. So in that sense, you control who has access to what resources in Azure and what sorts of applications and what resource groups and all that standard Azure security stuff that we like to talk about. The other part of this, and this is where this starts to become more powerful than just an authentication mechanism, is that application developers can build Azure Active Directory single sign-on into their applications for both logins, which are people. We'll talk through these terms in a few slides. But they can also do this for identities. So they can give their application an identity so it can communicate with other resources. This is what's known as a service principal, and it's a key to a lot of scenarios. And in a few slides, we'll walk through a sample app scenario of what that looks like. Finally, if you're using Microsoft or Office 365 or whatever they're calling it this week, as a subscriber, you're inherently using Azure AD. This was kind of a problem we ran into a lot in early Azure deployments where one part of the organization might have implemented Office 365. As the IT organization moved into Azure, they didn't have the same tenant ID, and they had a problem, which I'll talk about now. This is kind of the architecture of how things work. In this scenario, we have one tenant. The tenant's kind of the high-level overarching thing. And we have a one-to-one relationship between our Azure Active Directory and our tenant. This can span multiple subscriptions. The DCAC subscription or a tenant, for example, has 5 subscriptions, but we only have one directory, and that's connected to the tenant. The tenant is the overarching piece. So my identity in subscription dev test subscription 1 is the same as my identity in the production subscription. I authenticate the same way. The only thing that changes is the subscription ID property of my connection. And what we have on the left here with those two balls is you can see Office 365 creates a shadow Azure tenant to store the Azure Active Directory. So that's just something to be aware of. And a lot of times organizations will start a new Azure account and not know that that's out there. It's been less of a problem in the past couple of years, but a few years ago it was kind of a really big problem. But that's the hierarchy. I'll give you a couple of practical examples. We have some customers that like to split up their subscriptions across organizations within their organization. So like finance might get one subscription, marketing might get one subscription. Everybody can still log into all the subscriptions at that point. There are other scenarios where you might actually want to have separate tenants, and I'll give you an example with a customer I have. They have a customer-facing database solution. So they have a database, sets of databases they sell the access to these databases, and those go directly to customers. So customers will be logging into Azure SQL Database as themselves, or potentially as a new Azure Active Directory login. And they wanted to separate that out from their core business resources, which are also in Azure. So in that case, what they did was they used two separate tenants in two separate subscriptions. So they have two directories. What they then did is guested all of the administrators who needed access to that second subscription into the second subscription. So that's kind of how that works, and it works pretty effectively. So there are a few ways you can do your organization and define it. It's a little, one thing that you'll note is a little bit easier, and I'll talk more about this a little bit later. Giving other organizations access to your Azure Active Directory is definitely a lot easier than it was an on-prem Active Directory, where you would have to do a domain trust. With Azure Active Directory, you can just guest users from other organizations into your org. And that doesn't necessarily give them any rights, because if you haven't assigned them any permission in Azure, they really can't do anything. They won't be able to see any resources or anything like that. But for example, if I wanted to give Joey at dcac.com access to a database in joeydantoni.com, which is also my Azure domain, I could simply create Joey at dcac.com in the Joey D'Antoni domain and give access to that user. So going cross-tenant is fairly easy. The user just has to exist in the directory. So Azure Active Directory is really a comprehensive identity and access management solution. So it both identifies and authorizes who you are. So it tells the application that I'm Joey, and Joey has the rights to do the following things. You can let him in. Very comprehensive, very globally scaled across all Azure regions. It's kind of like Active Directory 2.0 in my opinion. It's probably a better, more modern identity management solution than Active Directory. We also have B2B and B2C, which means we can give access to customer accounts, like using Microsoft accounts that were formerly known as live IDs, or B2B, where, as I just mentioned, we can share between organizations. This gives us a lot of flexibility and a lot of power in what we can do in our Active Directory AAD environment, and gives us the ability to build custom apps that work really nicely. So I just wanted to cover the terms that are associated with Azure AD. Some of these are generic kind of terms, but identity is a thing that can get authenticated. This can be users or a service principal. We also have groups in Azure Active Directory. They can come from either Windows AD, or that you can define them just in Azure Active Directory. And you can assign privileges to those groups just like you would anywhere else. So role-based access control, somewhat standard thing. An account is an identity that has data associated with it. An Azure AD account is also known as a work or school account. If you're logging in, you may get prompted with that if you have a work or school account. This is an account that's associated with an organization's tenant. And this just means it's an account that's in an Azure Active Directory somewhere. Azure AD Global Administrator, this is the highest privilege. And by the way, this is kind of a weird privilege in that it gives you permission to manage the directory, but it doesn't inherently give you permission to do anything else in Azure. Azure Active Directory kind of has its own set of roles that are separate from the standard RBAC that Azure supports. A Microsoft account is a personal accounts, and these were formerly known as live IDs. These can be like Gmail accounts, Outlook.com accounts, anything that you use to log into Microsoft services as a person, but not as a person belonging to a corporation. A service principal is a special account that represents an application identity. So the easiest analogy to this is if you think of a service account that SQL Server runs under, this is conceptually the same idea as a service account. However, it works a little bit differently, and we'll illustrate that on the next slide. And so in this slide, we have three different companies in place. We have ADatum, which is the tenant that's used to deploy by the company that developed the app called HR. We have Contoso, which is the tenant used by the Contoso organization, which is a customer of that HR app. And we have Fabricam, which is another AAD tenant that's used by the Fabricam organization, which is also a customer of that app. So step one here, in the process of creating the application and service principals, these objects get created in the ADatum tenant. So that's in their Azure Active Directory. When Contoso and Fabricam administrators complete consent, what happens is a service principal object gets created in their company's AAD tenants and then assign the permissions that the administrator granted. Also, you can note that when the HR app can be configured or designed to allow consent by users for individual use. The consumer tenants of the HR application, Contoso and Fabricam, each have their own service principal object, which represents their use of the application at runtime, which is governed by their permissions consented by each administrator. The other place where this really comes into play for DBAs is in order to programmatically add AAD accounts to Azure SQL database. You have to make Azure SQL database have a service principal and give it an application identity, and then you can give it permissions in AAD to do lookups, and then you can add those users. That's a little bit of a challenge. Like I say, I'll link to Rob's blog post at the end where you can see how to do that. So the way we do this on-prem or even in the cloud is we can use Azure Active Directory Connect, and that's going to sync our Active Directory, traditional Active Directory, Windows groups, and users with our Azure Active Directory and have all those users be available in the cloud. There's a lot of options to this in terms of what we can do. By default, our passwords are going to be stored in the cloud in their hash version. However, you have the option to use ADFS, and then your passwords are stored in your ADFS server and not in Azure Active Directory. Some organizations do that. There's a couple of other benefits to having ADFS that let you do pass-through authentication in a few places. It is a more complex configuration. Just about every customer we've worked with has implemented AAD Connect because it's the easiest way to get all of your users into Azure in a hurry, and just it makes everything work nice. We'll demo this in a few minutes. This is just an executable that needs to run on the server that keeps your AD synced with Azure AD. In terms of Azure Active Directory, high availability, it's globally replicated. So basically that means you authenticate somewhere in the world. Microsoft has probably at this point close to 60 Azure regions. That number changes all the time. This service has to be very highly available because without it, nobody can authorize to Azure, and there are all sorts of problems that go beyond that. There are free, basic, and premium tiers. The premium tiers give you some better features, and actually one of the features is being able to assign AAD roles to a group, which is kind of useful in SQL Azure scenarios. Interestingly, some of those features that are premium features only get assigned, only require one user to be licensed for them to be available in the tenant. What that means is, and this happened at a customer the other week, we needed to do that particular feature, which is assign Active Directory roles to a group for a SQL database as part of the automation process we had built. And all we had to do was license one single user, and we got the feature. Other features are tied to users, so like things like privileged identity management is a P2 feature, and privileged identity management allows you to have more granular control over things like admin accounts. That obviously is a per user feature, so you would have to license all of your users who need it. Typically, most organizations consume these premium services as part of their Office 365 licensing, so it's not something they see directly. You do have higher levels of reporting. Microsoft has moved multi-factor authentication down to the basic tiers, so you don't have to necessarily have premium to get AAD, but there are a number of other benefits to that. So after you've got AAD Connect and Azure AD in place, one of the really kind of interesting things you can do is integrate to all of your third-party apps, whether it be Dropbox, Salesforce, Office 365 is kind of inherently there, ServiceNow, even Twitter or WordPress. Like we use Azure Active Directory for our WordPress authentication at DCAC. So that's kind of nifty there in terms of being able to have one control plane to access all of those solutions. It's hard to kind of argue with that. And just to give you an idea of what this looks like, We can allow customers and partners to access our Azure Active Directory. We can sync back to on-prem. We have multi-factor authentication with Azure Active Directory. The other thing I haven't really talked about yet, but we'll talk a little bit more later, with Windows 10, you can join devices, whether they be phones, laptops, tablets. They can all be joined to your Azure Active Directory. Is this the same as a domain joined machine? No, it's a little bit different. We don't use group policy as much. We use Intune, which has policies and is its kind of own management system. But this is a really good solution for devices that are deployed to the field. And I know nobody's really traveling this year, but like normally sales reps travel. We have that whole experience where they're not on Office VPN all the time, or they have to get to VPN to get a Kerberos ticket. When you join the machines to Azure Active Directory, they can get a new certificate from Azure AD over the internet without being connected to VPN. So it's kind of a better way to manage remote devices. And then of course single sign-on to all those third-party applications like Google, SAP, Salesforce, O365, Box, etc. Now let's do a demo of Azure Active Directory Connect. So for our first demo, I'll show you Azure Active Directory Connect. And the first thing I'm going to do is log into the Azure portal. And I'm going to launch Firefox here and I'll log in. Or I'll attempt to log in, hang on. And so you'll get to, if you're not familiar, you'll get to see the whole kind of experience. So I'm gonna log in as Joey at dcac.com here. And I am global administrator of this account. Sorry, I need to grab a password. There we go. It's going to prompt me to multi-factor authenticate here, which I'll do on my phone. Let's do Face ID verification. Save that password. And then we'll navigate here. And since this is the first time I've logged in from this computer, it's wanting to tell me stuff. And I'm not in the DCAC tenant, so we'll switch subscriptions. And we'll go to Denny Cherry & Associates Consulting. Here we can see our tenant information. I'm global administrator. We can see the last sync happened 4.52 hours ago. This also tracks a number of things like our logins. We can look and see who's logged into what and when in the last 24 hours, and it will show me from where people log in. This used to be way more interesting, but now hardly any of us travel. And then here I'll go to Azure AD Connect. And this can show us a few different things here. I'm just going to do view current configurations. Here I see we're synchronized. Our Active Directory domain is dcac.co. We haven't changed that because we bought the dcac.com domain later. But if we look, we're still synced as dcac.co. We have some synchronization settings here. Right now we have group write back and password write back disabled. I think some of those are premium features and that's why we didn't have it. Also user write back. So if we create a user in Azure Active Directory, it won't get created in an on-prem Active Directory, which is kind of the way we want it for our particular case. We store everything in a local SQL Server database. We don't have Azure Directory Federation, Active Directory Federation services, so all our authentications take place in the cloud itself. So just to show you some of the other features here that you can see in the portal, here's where your app registrations are. And these are applications we have that are using Azure Active Directory. Some of these are expired. These do have certificates and they need to be kept up to date, but we see DCAC. I've created a few things. We had an HD Insight account that had an identity. Several other things like automation can get an identity, and that identity can be granted access to Azure resources. For example, I can give access to an Azure SQL database to my automation account so it can log into the database as itself. It's a little more complicated than just doing it in Windows or in SQL Server the old way, but it is something that's possible. Here is just an example of some of the wide variety of applications that are supported. There's two things you should really note. There's over 5,000 applications that are supported now, so just about any major third-party application will support Azure Active Directory. The benefit of that is that it's very easy to sync these environments. It's even if you're building a custom application, it's just a few lines of code. I mentioned earlier we use Azure AD for our WordPress authentication. What that gives us is the ability to just use Azure Active Directory, and we get multi-factor authentication and all those benefits along with it. There's no real downside other than some of these applications will charge you for it. I know DocuSign's one that's fairly expensive unless you're on DocuSign Enterprise Premium. They'll charge a per user cost for AAD auth, which is kind of crap, but it's their business model, so I can't yell at them too much. So here we see how we can sync AAD. We have Connect Health, we can monitor that. We have our Workday app, we have PowerShell. We have these two identities that are shared between these solutions. So you define an identity on-prem that doesn't break any of your existing workflows, so you can still define them in Windows Server Active Directory, and then they get uploaded effectively to Azure Active Directory. We can also sync them back through a couple of means. So we have our software as a service apps. You can build your custom applications, literally just a few lines of code. You can even put them back to web apps. And this is kind of a scenario where you might have something that doesn't support AAD auth, but you can use Azure Active Directory application proxy as a front end to an app. And we'll talk about that here on the next slide. And this is a really kind of a cool cloud service that I like. It's something that I don't think gets talked about enough because it's a fairly common scenario. You can access on-premises apps securely. You connect to a cloud service and auth with AAD. And then that's going to route the traffic via secured connectors. And it can be Azure or third-party Amazon IaaS solutions. And those connectors then will route the traffic to connect, or you can go to connectors that are in your corporate network, which are next to the applications. And then you connect to the cloud service that routes their traffic to those resources via the connectors. So this is all secure. We're connecting via a proxy, as you can see there, apex-contoso.msappproxy.net. Really cool solution, especially for legacy apps that you have pain points with serving to external users. This is another key thing, and if you haven't used this, you probably will at some point in the future. This is Microsoft Authenticator. So this provides MFA. I'll show it to you on my phone. Hang on. You can see I have a number of services there. I have Azure AD for joey@dcac.com, Twitter, Instagram, GitHub, a couple of other solutions that I have. This is what backs multi-factor authentication in Azure, and you can do device registration with it, and it'll tie into Windows Hello, that potentially passwordless authentication, which is kind of awesome. It now uses Face ID on my phone, so a very secure solution for multiple ways of authenticating. This ties into multi-factor authentication. So if you don't know what multi-factor authentication is, it's part of it's having a second thing. So it's the identification code that's associated with your bank card, where you go to the cash machine, and you have to it's a thing you know and a thing you have. So in the case of a password, you know your password, and then you have your mobile device. and you can approve the authentication. It's just an additional security thing, and in 2020 it's something we absolutely need because passwords can get hacked very easily, especially if you use weak passwords or your password gets dumped in some sort of data breach. Those happen all the time. So having this available is very, very important. We use it across all of our customers. So it also works fine with SQL Server, Azure SQL. So you can authenticate with multi-factor authentication. That's built into both Azure Data Studio and SQL Server Management Studio. We'll do a demo of that in a couple of slides. So this is configurable by your application. You can use mobile. You can use the mobile app like I just showed. You can receive a phone call. You can receive a text message. You can also input a code from the app. The input a code from the app is good for solutions where you might be offline or you only have one device that's online. The common scenario I always hit back when I was traveling was that I'd be on a plane and I could only have one device on the in-flight Wi-Fi. So in order to MFA with Authenticator, I would use the code from the application. So Azure SQL Database fully integrates with Azure Active Directory, as does Managed Instance. One common question I know I received a lot when I was in the SQL Server booth at Microsoft Ignite last year was how is Azure Managed Instance going to support traditional on-prem Active Directory authentication? Because a lot of orgs haven't moved to AAD yet. I thought that was a really interesting question. I know it's something the SQL Server team is working on, but I didn't know where they are yet. But kind of the way this works by default is each SQL Server has a Azure Active Directory admin in Azure. So whether you're on a managed instance or a SQL database, typically you want to make that Azure Active Directory admin a group of users, so that kind of just like you would have a SQL admin group on-prem, you would want to do that in Azure. Here you see we reach out to AL SQL. If you're using ADFS, then it will re-authenticate back on-prem. There's still some wonkiness I find with like PowerShell connections to Azure SQL Database using AAD. DBA Tools supports it. Invoke SQL CMD does not. So with DBA Tools, you can do it fine. You can actually use SQL CMD and that will work, which is good. The real issue comes down to Azure Automation. When you're using Azure Automation, you kind of have to use DBA Tools instead of using Invoke SQL CMD, and that's not a problem. It's just something I wish Microsoft had some first-party support. And the reason for that is obviously SQL CMD is an executable. In Azure Automation, you don't really have the concept of calling an external executable. You can only call PowerShell modules. So that's where there's a little bit of a gap with Invoke SQL CMD, but I would think we will see that going away in the future. Next, we'll do a demo of SQL Azure and AAD, and we'll walk through that. So here we're in the Azure portal for Azure SQL Database, and I'm going to go ahead and click on AdventureWorks 2014, which is our demo database, and I'm going to navigate to the server name, which is dcac-demo at databaseserver.net. Here I can see I have a server admin of Jay D'Antoni. Fun fact, you can't change your SQL user server admin after the fact. So that user is permanently and forever Jay D'Antoni. That's established at the creation of the Azure resource. The Active Directory admin, which is a little bit of a misnomer, is SQL admins. That's an Azure Active Directory group. And I can change that, I can set it, I can do anything I want after the fact with that. This group of users has full access to every database, and this is kind of handled externally to SQL Server. The way it's done in SQL Server is a little bit odd, but typically the best practice I would recommend is set this to a group. It can be the same as your DBA group. One thing you should note with Azure SQL is that you do not have the ability to use on-prem AD groups in Azure SQL. So you can create a shell group for them. So you can create a group called AZ DBAs that contains your on-prem DBA group. but that's something you need to do in order to do that. The one other thing I want to point out here is advanced data security. This is where threat detection is. I have it off on the server because it costs money, but we can see the different types of resources. So we can see SQL injection vulnerability, data exfiltration, brute force, or anomalous client login. So those are all things that we can turn on and enable, and Microsoft will send us a weekly report on that. The other thing I want to do is pull up Azure Data Studio. It's in my other window. I'll have to get it here, and I'll blow this up a little bit. And we'll go ahead and remove this connection because it may be offed already. So I'll go ahead and, let's see, manage, delete connection, and then I'll add a new connection. I'll try to add a new connection. There we go. So I'll say DCAC demo database.windows.net. And you'll see here I have a few options. Well, actually in Azure Data Studio I have fewer options. My only option here is Azure Active Directory Universal with MFA support. And I'll say add an account. And this will take me to the Azure portal, or the login, I should say. And I'll log in as Joey, it's dcac.com. And my account will be added successfully. And since I had just recently MFA'd, I think that's why I wasn't prompted. Let's see what happens when I connect. And then it's going to have me add a firewall rule because I haven't done it yet for this server. But that's what that experience looks like using Azure Data Studio. The experience is a little bit different in SQL Server Management Studio. You'll get a browser login where you'll log in kind of in a more traditional fashion. This is almost doing a machine authentication like you would do in PowerShell. One of the main challenges we face in a modern world is that identities live in too many places. In the olden days, we had this scenario on the left where we just had Windows Server AD, we had 4 sets of servers, LDAP, Finance, Web Apps, and HR and Oracle. Now, we kind of live in a crazy hybrid world. So this is a little bit of a challenge that Azure AD helps resolve, but it's by no means complete. One of the things that I don't like is there's no concept of OUs. Azure AD is just a flat structure, which means your user list can become unruly. In general, it's easier to manage, in my opinion, than AD, but there are still some headaches. So this is another component that I mentioned earlier, but you can Azure Active Directory join your Windows 10 machines. This supports hybrid environments. It supports you having access to on-prem apps. You can use Intune, which is the mobile device management solution from Microsoft. You install an app from your company. This gives you pretty good control over the device as an administrator. You can push other applications to the device. You can have requirements, so you can have things like password requirements and antivirus requirements in place. It's not quite the same as group policy, but it's also doesn't, the key difference here between just domain joining a machine and Azure Active Directory joining a machine is that you can the user doesn't have to be connected to your corporate network in order to get Kerberos tokens. Azure Active Directory is publicly accessible, so they don't have to have a VPN. You can obviously push and control a VPN through it, but you don't have to have that VPN, which is frequently a problem with mobile users. We also have a single identity and access management console. This is pretty awesome, so that this is just effectively saying that we don't have, if we drop a user, it's going to be, the user's going to be, or disable users access, the user's going to be disabled across your organization. Also, if you had given access to a user in another organization, so if Joey at dcac.com had access to joeydantoni.com and something terrible happened and Joey at dcac.com was terminated, Joey at dcac.com would no longer have access to the joeydantoni.com tenant. So this all works pretty well. Groups are dynamic, so the same kind of thing. If Joey at dcac.com was in a group called SQL Admins and he was terminated, the membership in the group would also go away. And we also have identity-driven security. So there are a few other things we have, like privileged identity management, which can be used to manage access to admin accounts. You can build things like break glass accounts that can only be used during certain times or from certain machines. And these are all conditional. And one of the real benefits you get in security with Azure Active Directory is Microsoft gets all these attacks. Let's face it, they're a pretty interesting threat target. So they're constantly looking out and evaluating and building new solutions that allow them to better serve their customers. A few things that have recently changed is they've added MFA based on conditional MFA. So if you log in from an unusual location or from an unusual machine, they will MFA the account just to verify that it's you. So this is something that you don't even necessarily control. There are some ways you can control it, but that's, to me, pretty awesome, because if you think something's suspicious and you want to MFA the login, you'll just go ahead and do it. That's one of the reasons why they ask for your email account and your phone number. Cloud App Discovery is another feature I'd like to talk about. This allows you to inspect your organization for other cloud apps. So a good example of this might be if some user is using Dropbox and OneDrive is your preferred remote storage solution. This can help you potentially prevent data exfiltration events from happening. I mean, obviously there are other things that you need to have in place to prevent data exfiltration, but this is a good example of one that you can take advantage of. So this is something that kind of comes into play with Azure SQL too, and I'll talk about it in conjunction with that. Microsoft looks at a lot of behaviors, and they have advanced threat detection. And SQL database and managed instance also have advanced threat detection, and it's kind of a subset and a superset of features that are more specific to SQL Server. So they're looking for things like SQL injection attacks or anomalous logins, like if I'm suddenly logging in from Singapore 5 minutes after I logged in from Philadelphia, things that just shouldn't happen. That's where Microsoft can kind of try to help and block those things and err on the side of failure rather than allowing an attacker to gain access. And they're constantly evaluating the platform. And if we look at it at a higher level, we have Azure Active Directory here. We're managing our identity with hybrid integration. You're using Intune to protect your devices. You're using information protection and advanced threat analytics to better detect those attacks early. You kind of have a complete solution. And so the way threat analytics works is that Microsoft gets these all Active Directory related traffic and collects relevant events from SIEM, which is endpoint management. It learns all the typical behaviors of the application. So ATA learns all those things and what they normally look like. And then it will build an organizational security graph, which helps them detect suspicious activities, but not before they've been verified. So this leverages years of world-class security research to detect known attacks and detect issues taking place regionally and globally. And it will automatically guide you, asking you simple questions to adjust the detection process to your input. We also have this rich standard-based platform for development. This is kind of one of the other key components of Azure Active Directory. So custom line of business applications can integrate with AAD. You can sign into those integrated applications with your cloud identity. You can access Office 365 and other web APIs for auth. You can extend the Azure Active Directory schema with your application, so you can add custom things. You have cross-platform support. You can log in on iOS, Mac, Android, or Windows. It's the modern Microsoft. We can do everything everywhere. And this uses open standards like SAML for authorization, OAuth 2.0 for authentication, OpenID Connect, and OData 3.0 for exchange. The Azure Active Directory Graph API gives programmatic access to Azure AD through OData REST API endpoints. Applications can use this Graph API to perform create, read, and update and delete operations on directory data and objects. So you can use within your app the Graph API to create a new user, update the user's properties or view them, change a user's password, and check group membership for role-based access, or disable or delete the user. Those are all kind of options you have. Azure Active Directory is identity management for the cloud and beyond. This can be on-prem, hybrid, cloud, multi-cloud. You can use Azure AD. It's a very different architecture using OAuth and SAML than Windows Server Active Directory, which uses LDAP and Kerberos. For the most part, this doesn't really change your job as a DBA. The key concepts you need to know are users and really roles and service principals and how those affect your Azure SQL database. Thank you for attending this session. I'm Joey D'Antoni. You can reach me on Twitter at jdanton or at joey@dcac.com by email, and you can find my blog at joeydantoni.com.